Welcome, and thanks for joining us for Two Steps Forward, our daily Bible study. I'm James. This is my wife, Ade. We are today starting a new book of the Bible, the book of Daniel, and we are up to episode 342 in our continued series for Two Steps Forward. But the book of Daniel is one that a lot of people love. The narrative portion of it is kind of exciting and interesting. It teaches us how to live as faithful believers without compromising our faith, despite living in a pluralistic society, which means a society that is certainly not predominantly of the true faith. Mm-hmm. So anything new for you, Ade, before we get started?
Oh, I just want to tell everyone that I did my own taxes this year, and now I feel like I could rule the world.
Yeah.
I'll let you know if I get audited.
We've seen a couple of different things recently. It's just really fascinating about how essentially the way the U.S. works taxes is you have to go through this complicated system. Like, the government knows exactly what you owe. They make you calculate how much you're supposed to owe.
I don't think they know.
They make you send that in, and then if you're off, well, how do they know how to penalize you after that? If you're off, then they send you to jail. It's like a broken system.
I think they actually know. I think they're putting the onus on you to figure it out. And then they audit a certain percentage, which I did read that people who are considered self-employed, like James, and people who do their own taxes are much more likely to get audited.
We're doomed.
So we'll see. I did realize today, after I submitted it, that I had kind of made one mistake. I left something off that I didn't mean to. It was totally inadvertent.
It's a good thing to admit to the internet right now.
And we'll see I don't know. We'll see.
I think we're pretty close within a half a percentage point, so we shall see. But we're up to, again, episode 342, Daniel 1 today. If you haven't read through Daniel, please be sure to do so right now. And here's my personal summary of the first chapter. Around 605 BC, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon defeated King Jehoiakim of Jerusalem. This was the Lord's doing, we're told, in response to Judah's, the southern kingdom's, unfaithfulness. The Babylonian army carried off the treasures from the temple, and the king ordered that the best and the brightest young men in Jerusalem be brought into the Babylonian assimilation program. This was to take place over the course of 3 years, at which point they would then be in charge of assimilating their own native people. The Jews chosen were named Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, who became known in Babylonian culture as Belteshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Daniel and his friends resolved not to eat the king's food that was offered to them because it was a violation of God's laws concerning the Jewish dietary restrictions. Daniel asked his supervisor for permission to only eat vegetables and drink water. His supervisor was fine with the idea, but if the young men ended up looking weak, the king would be upset with him, and Daniel promised his supervisor that if he just gave him a 10-day test, he would prove that it was going to be fine. Daniel's supervisor agreed to the 10-day test, and as Daniel predicted, after 10 days, the young men actually looked healthier than their peers. Furthermore, we're told that God's intervention in their lives also included these four performing amongst the best of all their peers in the program. Daniel was even given the ability to interpret dreams, and when King Nebuchadnezzar eventually met Daniel and his friends, his assessment was that they were 10 times greater in their aptitude than their peers. The final note of this chapter is that Daniel remained in his position of prominence through the first year of Cyrus of Persia. By God's providence, he is going to actually completely outlast all of the leaders of Babylon and the Babylonian nation itself, which is kind of an interesting note to share with us up front at the beginning of the book. But we know where it's going. So that's Daniel chapter 1.
So how long is this after... I don't know, give me another reference point. Are they in the promised land?
Yes. So the numbers that I encourage people to memorize for the Old Testament, it's really only 4 of them. 2000 BC is Abraham. 1500 BC is the Exodus with Moses. 1000 BC is King David. And 500 BC is the return from exile, the return from Babylon. It's actually more like 536 BC is the first wave, but Nonetheless, those are roughly the dates. So we are at 605 BC is when Jerusalem is destroyed. 586 BC is considered like the fall of Jerusalem. 605 is the first, the defeat of Jerusalem comes in waves. The defeat of Judah does. The first deportation is around 605 BC.
So why did God allow it to happen?
Because he had warned through the prophets that if the Israelites kept worshiping foreign gods, he was going to discipline his children. He had prophecies already in place that they were going to, so like even Isaiah, who's around 700 BC, has a prophecy about a king named Cyrus who is going to come and free God's people from slavery. This is before Babylon even takes the southern kingdom of Judah. So it's a good 150 or so years in advance. But yeah, God's people, despite his continued warnings, would not give up their idols. So, yep, this is discipline. God, a loving father, disciplining his children, as harsh as it seems to be.
Also,
Yeah.
Can you see this map?
I can, but they can't.
They went from Jerusalem to,
Yeah.
why didn't they, and that was 500 miles, so why didn't they just go right from Jerusalem to Babylon? So all the Israelites had to walk 500 miles over to Babylon?
Yeah. Travels like that are often dependent on things like topography and water. So like you have to stay nearby a water route. So you travel by a river.
So they traveled down the Euphrates.
Correct. Yeah. Yep. That's usually what dictates ancient, especially
My
travel.
dad needs to go back in time and tell them that the shortest distance is between 2 points is a straight line.
This is true. That is, carrying that many canteens across the wilderness is tough, though. So you got to stay by a moving body of water. All right, devotional thoughts for the day. Number 1, we're going to call it cultural indoctrination. So the Babylonians had a really interesting, kind of innovative way of defeating nations. Unlike other former ancient societies, instead of defeating people and merely enslaving them, what the Babylonians generally sought to do was take the best and the brightest from a population that they had conquered and bring them into their assimilation program. It was like college for 3 years. And they would take, let's say, the most influential 5%, right? And the ones who had the best test scores, the most attractive ones, etc. And then what they would do after 3 years of cultural indoctrination is they would teach people, the language, the customs. They would give them new names. They would give them different dress. And then those influencers, for lack of a better term, were supposed to then go and assimilate the rest of their people. So I think influencers is probably the right word to use here. Daniel's name, in Hebrew, Daniel's name meant God is my judge. His name gets changed to Belteshazzar, which means something like Baal protects his life. And actually all of the Jewish men who formerly had names related to the name Yahweh or God, the God of Israel, but they're all changed to relate to the various gods of Babylon. So the Babylonians are essentially attempting to brainwash the most influential people of society and then release those people back into their own native peoples so that they can brainwash the rest of their own country. It's Babylon prided itself on supposedly being pluralistic and open-minded and inclusive, but inclusive only insofar as people bowed down to the inclusive disposition of the Babylonians. So I think the question there today then is, how do you think Satan is attempting to use the same types of cultural influencers to get us to bow down to the wrong gods?
Yeah, they make me think that the way I look is more important than anything.
Which we've talked about before, the gods. So like Baal and Asherah it's more complicated than this, but they're essentially like gods of money and sex, money and beauty. Right, so
yeah, to focus on the wrong things. I was looking at Instagram the other day, and I realized, like, very few things I'm actually looking at are like things from my in real life friends. It's mostly like ads and for some reason like cat memes. Well, I know the reason, but
yeah. So you're looking at a constant scroll of images of humans who are supposed to be more beautiful than you, funnier than you, wealthier than you, dress better than you, And if you just follow their operations, then you can be about as good as they are.
It's just so easy. I feel like Satan's like, man, like they made it as easy for me as possible to lead everybody into temptation.
Yeah, you can scroll through all your gods repeatedly throughout the course of the day and never actually run out. It's infinity at this point.
I think I've said this before, but I remember one time I went off Instagram and I said, honestly, what I miss is the ads. Like, I don't know what's in fashion. I don't know what I should be buying. What new anti-aging products are out there?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, this is, I'm not trying to demonize all marketing and whatever, but you just have to, use, idolatry is the only verbiage I've found to be able to describe, our disordered loves in the modern world. You know, it's like we don't even have a word in modern society because Satan has deprogrammed us of a religious language. We think these are all just our choices, but they're forces that control us and control our choices and behavior and that sort of thing. All right, so cultural indoctrination was number one. Devotional thought number two is lifestyle evangelism. Daniel and his friends refused to eat the food that comes from the king of Babylon, not because they're picky and difficult, but because there was actually several aspects to the Jewish food, or to the Babylonian food, like the idea of it being, for instance, sacrificed to various idols, that would have been prohibitive to Jewish dietary restrictions. So Daniel and his friends, what they do, they don't cry and moan and demand their rights. Nor, the other side of the spectrum is they don't use their difficult circumstances as justification for defying God's laws. So it would have been very easy for them to say well, God, you allowed us to get in this circumstance, so we have to defy your laws now. Nope, they don't do that either. Rather, what their methodology here is they identify, first of all, a leader amongst the Babylonians who seems to be reasonable and sympathetic to their circumstances. They asked for something different than what they were getting, but not something more. So they actually asked for less. Mm-hmm. So they're we'll just eat the vegetables and water. We don't want to partake of all of this stuff. So they're not asking for special treatment in the sense of more. They're asking just to refrain and to do less. And the third thing they do is they propose a limited test by which they're confident God is going to bless their faithfulness. So it's this 10-day test. See if we, what the Babylonian leader is concerned about is if they're not eating the full diet, they're going to look weak and famished and unhealthy. And they say okay, let's try it. 10 days, see if we don't look as healthy. And it turns out not only do they look healthier, but they seemingly are more intelligent, have greater aptitude, have greater skill sets, to such a degree that the king then says, man, these guys have 10 times the aptitude of all their peers. So God granted it success, helps them become more healthier and more intelligent than their peers. I think this is a fascinating approach to interacting with society that is not what I generally perceive as at least the stuff that makes the news for Christians today interacting with society. So I think my question is, are there any missteps from the past 50 years where Christians have become entangled in politics, demanding their rights, asking for more, not being willing to sacrifice themselves? And you think this has been a poor, or maybe you think that Christians have done a good job of interacting with politics?
I don't know why they need to interact with politics at all.
Well, so you have to, it depends on what you mean by politics, but you have to interact with your society, mm-hmm. right? And maybe society is the better term than politics. But Daniel and his men, they have to interact. They can't just create their own Amish community and do their own thing. They have to interact with the king and the king's men.
Do you think Christians ask for special rights on things?
I think a decent amount of lobbying has gone on in the last 30, 40, 50 years, saying yeah, we're going to do this. But we don't want to do this. We don't want to participate in this, but not at cost to ourselves, at cost to others, kind of thing. You know what I mean?
Not really.
Well, for instance, there are, and I know that this is challenging, but to say you must allow us to do this or this within like a public school system. You must allow us to gather for prayer. You must allow us to whatever. You can't teach us this or that. I understand the concerns about why, because that would be perceived as indoctrination. And we're going to talk actually in a moment about secular education that Daniel and his friends got. But more often than not, it seems like Christians are asking for certain places and certain ways to do things, as opposed to saying like, yep, we will supplement the education by having our own at-home education after school or something like that. You know, it's whenever you're presenting yourself as a victim and not being willing to sacrifice yourself, those types of things. You know, I think I generally would look to things like the moral majority of the 80s and the idea of evangelical Christianity essentially trying to take over a little bit of American politics. So this a simple illustration of this would be the undeniable fact is that in 2016, over 80% of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. So you could say whatever you want about that, but it very clearly seems to be that Christians are aligning politically in certain ways. And so my recommendation at some points is maybe, yes, back out of politics. And I think that's kind of what you're advocating too.
Yeah.
But I think sometimes Christians want to say we have to get the right guy or the right woman in power in order to be able to get our way socially.
It's really tough because I think that even if you so we can use Donald Trump as an example. Like even if you think he's divisive, it doesn't have good character. He doesn't care about the marginalized. The Republican Party. This is like what's the word? Like when you start saying it about the majority.
Generalization?
Yes, a generalization. The Republican Party doesn't care as much about the marginalized as society. They don't care as much about like social justice. So as a Christian, like those are not things I would want to vote for. At the same time, it's really difficult as a Christian I think that the right to life, I think holds some people so staunchly to that Republican Party that they like almost overlook the other things.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I absolutely think
I don't know if that's right or wrong. It's one issue in a majority of issues. It's obviously a huge issue.
Right, and not all issues are created equal either. I would agree with that too. What our like foreign policy is on a certain issue versus the right to human life. But it's also much more complicated than one singular issue. And again, I don't think I would. I'm not suggesting, like when somebody votes for one person or another, I don't have really strong. I'm kind of trusting that they've thought it through and prayed it through as a Christian. I think what I'm saying is the default idea, the whole concept of politics is trying to get people in power and get a majority so that you can get what you want. I'm saying what Daniel and his friends seem to be doing is giving up things, not trying to get more things. And I think that's a better, more like Christ-like attitude rather than flex your power, release your power, and say like, yep, the Lord will take care of us. No. All right, devotional thought number 3 then, secular education. Daniel and his friends have been inundated in Babylonian higher education. Unquestionably, their higher education would have included Babylonian religion. It would have included Babylonian astrology, which is why we oftentimes connect, by the way, the wise men that come to visit, the Magi who come to visit Jesus in his early years, as coming from Persia, who probably they were astrologers. They probably had read some of Daniel's writing and studied under Daniel, which is how they knew to expect this. But they studied religion, they studied astrology. This was all for them connected to the sciences. So very clearly they're getting some kind of secular education. There's been a lot of Christians over the years, like very sincere Christians, who have sort of bucked against the idea of secular education. This goes way back. One of the early Christian fathers by the name of Tertullian, I found one of the quotes from him. He's about 200 AD. And he said, for example, so then, where is there any likeness between the Christian and the philosopher, the secular philosopher, between the disciple of Greece and the disciple of heaven, between the man whose object is fame and whose object is life. In other words, he was very much against becoming indoctrinated with like secular wisdom, right? So faithful early church father who has that position. On the other hand, you have very clearly characters in the Bible who are highly educated in secular education. So Moses, we know, is educated in the Egyptian court, gets a world-class education there, but not a like believer education. The Apostle Paul is a really interesting one because we know he quotes at least 4 classic Greek philosophers: Menander, Epimenides, Aratus, and Cleanthes. So he's very well versed. In fact, that's part of his evangelism technique. Is he says, "Your philosophers say this. Let me show you something that's even wiser than that." And so I think you could argue that both sides have some merit, fighting against being overly inundated with secular wisdom and philosophy, or learning good things from secular wisdom and philosophy. I think what that means then is we probably should just be really slow to judge somebody else's viewpoints on things like education and related matters. So like, for instance, as somebody who I only grew up receiving Christian education, you only in your life have gotten essentially secular education, right? We're both Christians, and I think both of us would argue for and against some aspects of our education, right? That there were pros and cons to either having a private Christian education or a public school education. I just think you have to be very careful whenever you make absolute statements about public education, private education, homeschool education, all sorts of trust fellow Christians to come to their own conclusions on these kinds of things, because we have a lot of freedom in them. My question is for you is, as somebody, I actually think probably a good chunk of the people who study with us probably did get like a private Christian education. Is there anything that you would point to as possible strengths or weaknesses of your public school education?
Well, I think something you have to be able to learn to do as an adult is to discern between different things and say like, is this truth, or why is this truth?
Yeah.
So, for example, if you send your kid to a public school and they're taught evolution, like you have to be able to talk through with that child why it's first of all that it's a theory and what that means. And second of all, like that is taught through a Christian worldview and not a biblical worldview. And teach them actually like the difference between the two. So I actually feel like a public education provides a lot of opportunities like that to, instead of just like thinking like, well, my kid's learning the Bible, I don't have to like talk through any of these things. You know, I feel like sometimes kids don't learn how to discern certain things. Like, wouldn't you say, I think I've heard you say before, like at your seminary, like you didn't read any literature that wasn't Wells.
That wasn't like Lutheran,
wasn't Lutheran. So that does a disservice to you because there's a lot of great Christian literature out there, and B, you're not learning to actually discern whether something's like, to base it against the Bible and say like, well, is this true, or how does this change my thinking or my viewpoint on things? Does that make sense? Also, public education is free because I'm already paying for it.
I thought you bring up a number of great points. Number one, when parents just flat out outsource their kids' discipling to either a public education or a Christian education, they're not carrying their parental responsibility as a Christian parent. So it's whether you're sending them to a private school or a public school, if you're saying other people do this for me, that's the wrong attitude, right?
I think the best argument I've heard for private school, this is probably from you, is so like if you send like St. Marcus, for instance, most of the children in that school are not churched, correct? So then if you're sending your child to that school as a Christian, because they are believers, that they're actually like little missionaries or evangelists in that. Like, that's hard to argue against. Like, my kid's actually going to make a difference. It doesn't matter that he's 4 or 5.
There are a bunch of kids who are regularly hearing the gospel who would never hear it. In any kind of regular setting if they weren't going to the school. Which, yeah, I think that's the fact that the Lord provides a way for us to do that level of evangelism, in addition to providing a quality education.
But I'm saying if your kid who is a Christian, who acts differently, talks differently, theoretically thinks differently, is put in that environment, then you're just putting like salt out into the world, you know?
Yeah, no, I think...
so like that might sound like, oh, well, why does my kid have to? He's 4 years old. And in fact, I've heard someone say that. Yeah. Like I've given them this argument and they've said, well, he's 5 years old, you know, he's not a missionary. I'm like, but if he has that opportunity and he could be. Like,
well, no, I think it goes back to every family making, because it really almost boils down to a kid by kid basis for what I would be comfortable with. And I think that's appropriate. I think ministry is personally person by person in many instances. So it's not a one size fits all. I think that, what you said earlier also about a parent's, like, okay, so you send a kid to public school or private, but public school, let's say, and then you have to address, for instance, an issue like evolution, and like you're going to have to help them because at some point in time they're going to go out into a world that is not predominantly your home. You know, and they have to be able to think through these kinds of things, and they need somebody to like shepherd them through it along the way.
Additionally, when you get into public school, you actually learn about like different cultures and religions, and if you are never taught like the tenets of Islam, like you have no basis for any kind of apologetic conversations. Yeah,
well, so I do think that I think what you're addressing is there's a narrowness attached to a parochial, an intentional narrowness attached to a parochial education, and it could be to the extreme of, like you said, if there is a discouragement. If I go to a Christian school and I'm Lutheran, and there's a discouragement from ever reading anything that's not Lutheran, that's going to make my worldview very, very narrow as time goes on, just because I have a lack of exposure. And the human tendency then is to build walls and demonize anything on the other side of the wall, right? On the other side of the dividing wall. And what you don't want to do is demonize. You want to warn against things that could be negatively influential, but not demonize so many things like culture and whatever that are just neutral. People do have to be discipled on how to navigate the diversity as well.
Yeah, because you're right. You are going to have to do that out in the world. I think the public school leads to, I don't want to say this like rudely to you, like you are a critical thinker, but I think it naturally from a young age leads you to be more of a critical thinker because you have to reconcile some things you're taught with, like some things you are taught in the home. You know what I mean? You have to really think things through.
I think getting exposed to different things is healthy for the brain, and it's healthy for you as a sympathetic, compassionate human. I think you need somebody sort of shepherding you through different things so that you see they're not, from a Christian perspective, they're not all equal. And so I think that's kind of the balance is, as much as possible, whatever system is right for your family or for someone else, but you want to have a broad spectrum, but you nonetheless have somebody who's more spiritually mature than you shepherding you to navigate through all of it. So, all right, that's it for Daniel 1, okay? So should we close with a prayer? Father, you have placed us in the time and place we're at. We are living in a society that is, most sociologists would say post-Christian, which means that we don't assume everybody is a Christian. We don't assume everybody has the same value system. We don't assume everybody has the Spirit in their lives and that they love and appreciate Jesus as their Lord and Savior. That means we have a lot of responsibility and a lot of work to do in both living as your redeemed children and in telling people about the goodness of our Savior. This is a privilege, not just a duty, and not something we're scared of. Help us to do it boldly, but humbly, respectfully, and joyfully in sharing the light of Christ in a dark world. May it glorify your name. Amen. Thanks for studying with us today. We'll see you next time for Daniel chapter 2.